So you've brought a little, well, he's not little, he's actually quite large, tree dude to the party. And if he's a tree dude, and I assume it's a he, might be a she, I don't know. But, bark.
Yeah, and another question that nobody asked.
Right.
Can trees be evil?
Oh, yeah, well, evil is a like,
hey, everyone's the hero of their own story.
This is my point.
Right?
He's got a lot of skulls on him, but they're not like skulls of his friends.
Me too.
They're skulls of people that were probably attacking him. You've got a lot of skulls, yeah.
Got a lot of them tattooed on my flesh.
Sure, right.
Who's to say?
This is a good question.
All right, we'll let the sun god sort it all out.
Right.
But so what happens when you're trying to blend and your brushstrokes come out all streaky and crappy? Well, I'd like to show you how to use that to your advantage.
Yeah.
How painting with intentionally irregular results can produce some cool effects.
There are literally no mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you come up with something that's like, oh, that looks really weird, but then there's a time later on where you're gonna be able to use it. And in this situation, you're trying to simulate bark on a tree person.
Yeah.
And so there you go.
Yeah, exactly. So follow along. I like to say we don't make mistakes, we make nurgle, but that doesn't apply.
No, not this situation.
Here. So we make texture.
There you go.
What we make.
There you go.
All right, so we're going to get right to it. Applying some textures, but with a little bit of thought behind our strokes. A little bit of, not so much dry brushing, but we are going to be using, you see the tip of this brush, I'm going to keep it a little bit on the dry side because as you overwork the brush, it becomes a little frayed. This will become our textured applicator as of sorts. So, keeping in mind that the most upward area of the model, the highest level of whatever object I'm trying to create a gradient on, that accumulates the most brightness. First of all, I'm going to take a little paint off of my brush. Yeah, you can see how the tip of that is kind of frayed intentionally. And I'm also applying all these strokes in the same direction, more or less. I'm going for kind of this diagonal wind. I want to have this the texture of tree bark. So that's the first pass. It's a three-way mixture of colors. I'll show you those colors. Shazam. My thoughts behind that, I wanted something strong looking, something very earthy, so I want to think about the greens and the browns. A little bit of color alchemy, basically. So I've made a combination of these three colors, Thornwood Green from P3, as well as Coal Black, and Vallejo Buff for my ivory. Choose your own colors. You can work whatever colors you want to into this paint job. That's just my kind of basic philosophy, was just thinking about all the colors that would exist on this gnarled old tree, wrapping them all together in a trifecta. Originally I had a fourth color brought in there, but it didn't seem so necessary to have black mixed in, because I've got this black base coat. As acrylic colors dry, they tend to desaturate, so they lose a little bit of their luster. That black undercoat will show through, modify those first few coats, then I'll go back for a second coat with the same color, increasing the saturation, increasing the value. Again, let me show you just on this flat piece of plastic card what's happening. Just dragging the brush in the same direction. If it gets a little dried out, starts to lose paint, that's cool. It gets a little frayed, I'm starting to create my wood texture. Throwing texture on top of an already textured surface. What fun. And now as I'm moving up my gradient, I'll be adding larger amounts of Vallejo Buff into the mix. On your little swatch, it will look like so. And I'm going to try to target the areas where I've already laid down paint, so I'm leaving the black grooves showing in between. Always be pushing a gradient, cover less and less of the model as you go. Shingles on a rooftop. Just slowly graduating upwards. So I'll paint the same area, but leave a little bit of that first coat showing. Let's define it as a hemisphere or a quadrant. That lower quadrant will be paint free, the upper area much more heavily. Try to pick out some of the more prominent edges, but again, if I get that streaky look, that's a good thing. Or I'm aiming for a happy accidents, right? That famous line. Just letting the paint kind of end up, but applying it with some intention. You could certainly dry brush these colors on and apply it in the same progression. That's fine. But if you want to take things a little bit further, try it this way. Just like so. Now I'll just go for, it's good to work in threes, combination of threes. I call this the rule of threes. Apparently this is some kind of business lingo. I made this one up myself, but it applies to the business world. We're not talking about the business world. Stay focused, I say to myself. So let's throw a little bit more of that ivory mixed in kind of the upper third of the model's chest. You can see that gradient happening. All right. So once I'm happy with my results, I'm going to take some contrast paint. I have Wildwood and Basilicum Gray somewhere in here. There it is. A little Wildwood, a little Basilicum Gray. I like these. You could certainly use a different medium for this, for applying these, but I have the contrast paints. I'm trying to find other ways to use them, to incorporate them into my process, so take it or leave it. I've got a pair of contrast paints. I'll just pop them out. Makes for great YouTubing. Slowly open things up and deposit them on your palette. I'm not mixing them together. I'm applying them in separate puddles. And I'm going to place them in separate areas. I'll thin this down a little bit. The contrast paints have a very heavy amount of pigment. And just randomly apply the Basilicum Gray and the Wildwood in its own separate areas, because I want to create a little tonal variety, you know, mimicking nature, all the random colors that can end up on a tree, depending on what forest you're hanging out in. And the idea is that I have this textured surface. I'm applying some of these contrast paints, which have a habit of pooling up in the recesses and creating a smooth gradient. As I see it, when something falls into the shadows, it loses some detail. When it rises into the light, more detail is visible, such as these textures. So I'm okay with the contrast paint kind of taking things away, smoothing it into the recesses. Just like so. Not a bad start. I've got to stop, hit this with a hair dryer, dry this coat out, and then we'll come back for the final step. All right, studio magic complete. It is time for convenient timing. Time for the second pass. So before I start adding to more of the textures and the bark, I want it to look like there's a little bit of dirt, mud, wet sediment, something. You know, this is an animated tree monster. There can be more than just bark involved. There's a lot of things out in the forest. You just have to look. Sometimes you have to smell and lick. So we'll water down a little bit of bloodstone from P3, which is just a terracotta tone. I've been orangey brown. So let's show you how thin that is. You know, it's a nice transparent coat. Just something like so. And I'm just gonna dab it in, again, somewhat randomly, as in the case with the contrast paints. Gonna let gravity do the work for me, a little bit of capillary action, so I can just touch it into the crevices. And maybe I'll clean my brush off and just use it as sort of a blending nub. Smooth things out a bit, give a little taparoo. And when I was assembling this model, I had used some of that Martian Iron Earth, just a crackle medium from Games Workshop. And I'm making sure to touch this color into those crevices, as well as some other areas, some of the dirt pileups. Just as, you know, moisture tends to gather in the crevices out in the forest. So just here and there, whatever you're satisfied with. Everyone's impression is a little bit different. But decent. I've added a little bit of hue, a little defining to the crevices. I'll switch over to a smaller brush now. And I'm back to working the gradient, because I wanted to layer this bloodstone beneath all of the other layers of textures, you know, and I'm going to bring it back up with some sharper highlights. I'll use the pure ivory in the form of Vallejo buff. And very, very delicately pencil some lines in, mainly attending to the raised areas. Again, that upper area, the more light falling on an object, the more texture it will receive. Still always just pushing a gradient. And in this portion, less is more. You want to work in very small, kind of tiny dots and slashes. Make your highlights sharp and quick. Press very lightly. The harder you press the tip of your brush down, the wider it will become. So we press very lightly. Sometimes you'll see me make a stroke and I'll miss. That's me sort of calibrating, getting closer and closer to the object, maintaining a very light amount of pressure. Now, I want to highlight this area that falls into the shadow. Of course, there are some hard edges that will be catching some light as well, but in the interest of really pushing the gradient and the brightness upwards, when I'm highlighting the lower area, I will just add a little bit of that base tone into the ivory. So I'm highlighting with ivory kind of in the upper half, the upper hemisphere. And now I've got a little bit of that original base concoction. And I'll drop some highlights in the lower areas. Pick out some of those chips from the Martian Iron Earth, that textured paint. Try to ride along that edge as best I can. It's got these cool, like, runic swirls added into the sculpt. I want to be sure to give those just a little bit of attention. And voila, just like so. Now, I'm never quite satisfied. I want to push this even further. So I'll take that Vallejo buff, that ivory, and I'll add just a touch of white into it. Shingles on a rooftop, my friends, covering less and less of that area to be pushing the gradient. Very, very slight. And a very small radius. Accenting some of those striations and textures that I created. Mamma mia, that tree's alive. So, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks to Uncle Adam, the whole team at Tabletop Minions, every single Tabletop Minion on the planet, even the ones that don't know they're a Tabletop Minion yet. Thank you. You can catch up with me on the social medias. I have an Instagram. That's probably the most immediate way to keep up with me because it's the easiest place to dump things. I have a Twitch account. It's fun. I'll just say it's fun. It's random. You're seeing the PG-13 version of me when I'm on Tabletop Minions. I'll just say that. And I've also taken my act on the road. I've been teaching classes all over the place, out of country, within country. Catch up with me on Facebook. If you want me to teach in your area, send me a message. Maybe we can make something happen. But again, thank you all for tuning in, hanging out, and I hope that this was informative for you. I'll see you next time.